Why did the United States cover up mass vanishings of soldiers in Korea? Why did men in uniform walk into the fog of that war and simply never come back? The Korean Peninsula, winter, a frozen ridge lit only by dull artillery flashes on the horizon. A U.S. patrol moves out at dusk and according to the logbook, it never returns. No confirmed ambush, no bodies recovered, no prisoners recorded, just a quiet notation later buried in paperwork, not recovered. Fate unknown to this day. More than 7,000 American soldiers from the Korean War remain officially unaccounted for, a number that doesn't match the neat clarity of the official story. Decades later, families still receive the same careful phrases, the same rehearsed condolences, the same promise that all information has been shared. But behind those words lie blacked out pages, contradictory reports. At one particularly strange case, a unit whose last radio transmission sounded normal, until it cut off mid-sentence. With no sign of contact, no panic, no gunfire, if a patrol disappears in wartime, the military is supposed to know why. Here, again and again, the record quietly shrugs. What happened on that ridge, and on others like it? That is the question the files avoid, and that is exactly where we begin. The war that never really ended night in Korea didn't fall at press down. It wrapped itself around every ridge, every trench line. Every man who tried to make sense of a battlefield that changed shape the moment he looked away. And in that heavy, shifting darkness, the first disappearance we can trace began with something painfully ordinary. A routine movement order sent to a 5-man reconnaissance team near the Chongchon River. They left their position just after sundown, cold enough that breath came out as smoke, quiet enough that small sounds carried for miles. Their radio check-ins were clipped but calm, nothing chaotic, nothing unusual. For almost 2 hours, they moved exactly according to plan. Then the line went silent. At first, no one panicked. Radio failures were constant. Batteries froze. Wires snapped. But when the relief team pushed out before dawn, they found untouched snow and no sign of the patrol. No struggle. No drag marks. No tracks returning or retreating. Only the imprint of their initial footprints heading up the slope, spaced evenly, disciplined, as if nothing was wrong until they simply stopped near a line of wine-twisted pines. According to the after-action report, visibility had been poor. Enemy presence was uncertain. The explanation given was vague enough to feel safe, but specific enough to look official. A single sentence quietly removed responsibility, unit missing in action. Presumed lost due to hostile forces, but hostile forces leave evidence, and none was found. Not a casing, not a torn field jacket, not even a boot scuff on the frozen dirt. The officer who filed that report never spoke about it publicly, but in a private letter written decades later, he admitted something he had never put on paper. It looked like they walked off the map. That was the first story families never heard. The first case folded into the larger statistic. The first example of a vanishing that didn't behave like war, and it wasn't the last. Across the winter of 1950, disappearances quietly multiplied in patterns that were easy to overlook individually, but impossible to ignore when aligned together. Units that were stable one day simply went dark the next. Patrol points marked on maps with neat red circles were later erased, replaced with cleaner, less complicated lines. Each incident could be explained away confusion, retreat, enemy infiltration, but the explanations felt stretched, as if passed over a shape no one wanted to name. One night in early December, a Signal Corps operator monitoring radio traffic captured something odd. A transmission from an infantry squad retreating south of Cunary came through faint and distorted by interference. The voice was steady at first, describing movement along a frozen ravine. Then a pause, a short, sharp inhale. The tone shifted, as if the speaker had just seen something he didn't have words for. He began to say a location. The coordinates never completed. The line cut mid-breath. When the audio file was reviewed later, the official notation read simply, inconclusive, environmental interference, but the operator, interviewed years afterward, said the silence after that last half-syllable felt wrong in a way he never forgot. Not panicked, not chaotic, just cut off clean. These fragments of uncertainty, the missing tracks, the unfinished transmission. The reports quietly edited before filing began to form a shape that no one at the time wanted to confront. Commanders were overwhelmed. Retreats were frequent. Entire divisions were pulling back under pressure from massive Chinese offensives. In that chaos, the unknown found room to grow, but even chaos follows patterns. And these patterns didn't match the tide of battle. One particular document, declassified only partially and heavily blacked out, revealed a haunting detail. It mentioned an unnamed corporal who, according to surviving members of his unit, had reported unusual lights along a ridge shortly before he vanished. The term wasn't elaborated on. It wasn't even clear whether it referred to enemy lanterns, flares, or something else entirely. What made it strange was not the lights themselves, but the sentence that followed. It read, "This observation is not to be included in the formal record." A dozen questions rise from that single instruction, but none have answers. The names of the witnesses were scrubbed. The date was incomplete. Yet the command to erase the note remains visible, like a fingerprint left by someone in a hurry to hide it. Throughout these early months, as more soldiers vanished without a trace, a quiet tension began to build within the ranks. Men didn't speak openly about it, but they felt it. They sensed it in the long pauses before a patrol stepped out, in the way officers avoided eye contact when giving certain orders, in the strange habit some men developed looking over their shoulders at empty spaces, as if expecting someone to be missing when they turned back again. One survivor from the battles near the Chosen Reservoir remembered a moment during a retreat when he glanced behind him and realized the soldier who had been walking at his shoulder moments earlier was simply gone. No sound, no shout, no sign. The column never stopped. Stopping meant death. When asked later if he thought the man had been hit, he whispered, "I didn't hear a shot. I didn't hear anything." It was the silence that stayed with him, and the silence was spreading. As winter deepened, military intelligence officers began quietly gathering scattered reports of disappearances, trying to find logic in them. They expected randomness. Instead, a troubling possibility emerged. Several vanishings had occurred near the edges of territory, where neither side had full control. Places where the fog of war was not just metaphorical, but literal valleys, where sound behaved strangely, ridges where compasses wavered, frozen slopes where weather shifted without warning. In these spaces, certainty dissolved, and in the confusion, something else seemed to move unseen. A junior intelligence officer wrote a memo that was never publicly released. Only a fragment is legible today, but it contains one line that reveals the fear behind his words. If these men were taken, we cannot determine by whom. If they were lost, we cannot determine how. He underlined the next sentence twice. This pattern does not align with known enemy operations. This was the moment the mystery stopped being a series of isolated tragedies. It began to look like a problem someone didn't want to acknowledge, something the official narrative couldn't absorb without cracking. But before any investigation could solidify, something even stranger happened. One of the missing soldiers reappeared, not alive, not recently, but found by accident. Near a ridge where no battles had been recorded, his gear was intact. His weapon had not been fired. His body showed no wounds. His watch had stopped at a time that didn't match any engagement, and his dog tags were found not on him, but placed neatly beside a rock a few feet away as if someone had set them there deliberately. The report documenting his recovery was stamped and filed, then refiled, then edited with phrases that softened every detail that didn't make sense. When asked about the case years later, one officer said only, "We were told not to dwell on it." The mystery had entered a new stage now, one that reached beyond the battlefield. Files were being adjusted, explanations rewritten, witnesses encouraged to focus on what is certain, but certainty was slipping away. And in the next chapter, we follow the men who stepped into those uncertain places and never returned. Patrols that walked off the map. Snow was falling the night the Baker squad disappeared. Fine, powdery flakes that drifted sideways in the wind, softening the landscape until every ridge and ravine looked identical. The kind of night when even veterans struggled to keep their bearings. The kind of night that swallowed sound. Their orders were simple: move along the ridgeline north of Pujan, confirm Chinese troop movement, return before first light. Straightforward, predictable. The kind of mission men accepted without argument. Corporal James Rourke led them, 27 years old, quiet, steady, a man whose letters home were always brief, always practical, always careful not to worry anyone. In his last letter, written the morning of the mission, he mentioned the cold. That was all. Just cold. He wrote, a sentence so ordinary it feels heavier now. According to the field log, the squad checked in twice. Once at 1900 hours, then again half an hour later. Their tone was routine. No tension. No sense of trouble. They reported faint movement in the distance, nothing unusual for that sector. Their final call ended with a remark about adjusting their route to avoid a patch of unstable snow. Then silence, when dawn came and they hadn't returned. The platoon leader insisted it was a radio issue. Equipment froze, antennas snapped, but something in his voice suggested he didn't believe his own words. He organized a search team immediately. What they found was unnerving. The squad's footprints traced a neat path through the fresh snow. 5 parallel lines, steady and ordered, leading uphill exactly as planned. The prints were clear for hundreds of yards. Then they began to drift slightly, as if the men spread out. Not in panic, not in retreat, just spread, like they were adjusting formation. At one point, the prints doubled back, a small circle, the pattern indicating they had stopped to observe something. The search team paused there too. There was nothing to see now, only the vast white slope sweeping downward into a dark valley. But whatever the squad saw, it was directly ahead. From that point forward, the tracks became strange. They grew lighter, as if the men were walking with hesitant steps. Then one set veered left, another right, another continued forward. It was subtle, but wrong. Recon squads don't fracture without a reason. 50 yards beyond that, the snow ridge swallowed them. The tracks didn't fade. They didn't blur. They simply ended, as if each man stepped into a line drawn across the earth. Searchers knelt, brushed away the snow, dug into the ice, widened the perimeter. They found no bodies, no gear, no signs of struggle, no evidence of enemy approach, just an abrupt, impossible end. The report written that afternoon was clinical. It used the phrase environmental disorientation. Another note suggested the squad may have accidentally crossed into a ravine and been buried by snow. But if that were true, the search teams would have found at least a collapse, a shift in terrain, a depression. They found nothing. The families were never told how cleanly the tracks ended. They were told only that recovery was impossible. Terrain unstable, enemy presence heavy, all technically true, but not the truth that mattered. Other patrols soon began to echo the same pattern. One unit south of the Imjin River reported hearing voices during the night retreat, voices calling from ahead in broken English. They moved toward the sound, thinking survivors were trapped, but when they reached the origin point, there was only an abandoned trench and a faint warmth in the air, like someone had stood there moments earlier. When they backtracked, they realized 2 of their own men were missing. The squad leader insisted they had been right behind him. No one believed it at first. Then it kept happening. The men created their own quiet rule. Count heads every 10 minutes. Even if it slowed them down. Count, then count again, then touch the shoulder of the man beside you just to be sure he was real. And yet, men still vanished. One soldier later admitted he developed a habit of glancing at the thin line of gray sky between the mountains and wondering if something watched from that border. Not human, not supernatural, just something. But the most unsettling incident occurred near a narrow pass north of Hagaruri. A 7-man engineering detail was assigned to clear debris from a frozen road. The weather was brutal, wind slicing sideways, snow rising like fine dust. Visibility was limited, but not enough to hide something extraordinary. At 14:20 hours, the detail's lieutenant radioed command to report a strange formation ahead. He described it as a column of ice or vapor, tall and faintly shimmering. The transmission was steady, clear, calm. Something in his measured tone made the operators listening believe he wasn't frightened. He was confused. Seconds later, the lieutenant's voice returned, strained. "Hold on. Men approaching. Can't tell who." The line snapped. When the recovery team arrived, the debris had been cleared, but the engineers were gone. Their tools lay in a neat row beside the road, as if they had set them down intentionally. No struggle, no tracks, no bodies. Just that same impossible emptiness. What makes the case darker is what happened 2 days later. Another squad passing through the area found a single glove frozen to a metal stake. It belonged to one of the missing engineers. Inside the glove was a torn scrap of map paper with a mark scribbled in pencil. A mark that pointed toward a ravine the military had already searched. The paper was logged, then disappeared from the file. Someone didn't want that detail preserved. By late January, whispers ran through the camps. Men didn't speak openly. The war was too unforgiving for superstition, but in the quiet moments, they asked the same question. How does a man disappear so completely that even the snow refuses to hold his trace? Officers reacted in distinct ways. Some hardened, quick to punish any mention of vanishings, insisting the losses were ordinary. Others became watchful, lingering at the edges of darkness during night shifts. Scanning the hills longer than necessary, the pressure built silently, like ice stretching against stone. One night, Sergeant Lionel Briggs, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for absolute composure, requested to speak privately with his commander. According to the commander's later account, Briggs looked shaken. He claimed he saw movement on a ridge where there shouldn't have been any 5 figures, spaced like a patrol, standing still as trees. Their silhouettes matched no known enemy formation. When he blinked, they vanished. His commander dismissed it as exhaustion. Briggs didn't argue, but he didn't sleep that night either. He sat outside the tent with his rifle across his knees, staring into the dark. Hours later, he vanished too. When dawn came, the only thing left of him was the indentation of his boots in the snow, and his helmet placed neatly against a rock. The same pattern, the same quiet precision, the same silence. As these disappearances accumulated, something shifted in the atmosphere of the entire front. Even the most rational officers began to sense an unspoken tension and invisible boundary they struggled not to acknowledge, a place where their authority, their maps, their understanding of war began to lose meaning. The men who vanished were not weak. They were not untrained. They were not prone to fear. They were soldiers who understood the brutality of battle and accepted its risks. And yet they were taken by something no one could explain. As winter broke and the lines began to move again, command attempted to reorganize the missing into simple categories: lost, killed, presumed captured. But the numbers were wrong. The patterns didn't match. Files were changed. Coordinates shifted. Words erased. Because acknowledging the truth meant admitting something terrifying. In certain parts of Korea, entire patrols walked into the night and stepped out of the world we understand. Redacted lines and quiet decisions. The first thing you notice when you walk into an Army records tent is the smell. Damp canvas, cold ink, wet boots thawing near a stove. It is a scent that belongs to bureaucrats and battlefield survivors alike. A place where facts fight for order against the chaos outside. In the winter of 1951, the clerks inside these tents were drowning in reports, retreats, counterattacks, reinforcements, and threaded quietly through the stacks of paperwork, where the disappearance files, thin folders at first, then thicker ones, then entire boxes labeled with terms that tried to make the impossible sound administrative. One of the men responsible for processing those files was Lieutenant Mark Hennings, 24 years old, recently transferred from a logistics unit, not particularly superstitious, not particularly emotional. His job was to examine the casualty reports sent in from the field, reconcile contradictions, and prepare neatly typed summaries for higher command. But the first disappearance file he opened changed him. It was a case he assumed would be straightforward. 5 missing infantrymen whose patrol had not returned. The initial report described limited visibility and presumed enemy contact, standard language. Nothing strange. Then he read the supplemental notes. One line caught his attention immediately: tracks observed until point of sudden termination. He stopped and read that phrase. Sudden termination, not fading, not obscured. Termination. He turned the page and found another line. No enemy sign discovered. No weapon discharge detected. No distress calls recorded. He frowned. The account didn't match normal battlefield loss. It didn't even match the sloppy confusion of retreat. Men don't vanish cleanly. Hennings pushed the file aside, intending to revisit it later. But within a week, 3 more reports with similar wording crossed his desk. He began circling the repeated phrases. Sudden termination. No sign of enemy engagement. Tracks to point of disappearance. The pattern tightened around him. Invisible, but undeniable. When he brought the first set of files to his captain, hoping for clarification, the captain skimmed the pages with an expression too controlled to be natural. He closed the folder and slid it back. Clean the language, the captain said. Hennings blinked. Clean it? How? Use standard terms. Remove ambiguity. I don't think it's ambiguity, sir. I think it's Hennings. The captain leaned forward, voice low and firm. You're here to report what can be confirmed, not what raises questions. He tapped the folder once. Final. Make it match established classifications. The message was clear. Stop asking. But the files kept coming. One afternoon, a courier dropped off a sealed envelope marked Priority, Eyes Only. Inside was a single-page stripped of nearly everything except date, location coordinates, and a chilling instruction typed in block letters. This event is not to be documented. It's standard casualty logs. Below the sentence were black streaks of ink sensor marks where Whole paragraphs had been removed. Someone high up had decided this incident wasn't just unusual. It was to be erased. Hennings stared at that page for nearly an hour. The more he looked, the more he sensed that the missing words weren't hiding confusion. They were hiding a decision. That decision wasn't made for clarity. It was made for control. He began to compare redacted versions of reports with their original field notes. What he found unsettled him more than the disappearances themselves. Descriptions of strange lights were turned into difficult visibility conditions. Mentions of silent terrain became fog interference. Entire segments recording witness remarks were replaced with standardized lines like cause, undetermined but attributed. To combat stress, he realized he was watching a story being rewritten by people who feared what the original story implied. One night, long after most clerks had left, Hennings remained awake beneath the dim lantern glow, flipping through dozens of altered files. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls like a whispered warning. Inside, redacted lines looked like scars across the truth. He wasn't alone in his unease. Sergeant William Caro, a communications technician, visited the record's tent unannounced. He looked exhausted, eyes hollow, uniform stiff with frost. Caro asked a strange question. "Have you ever heard a voice go silent in the middle of speaking?" Hennings said yes. "Radio interference. Weather. Static." Caro shook his head. "No, not like that. Not interference. More like someone just stopped existing between one word and the next." He described a transmission from a recon team. Normal chatter. Footsteps crunching in snow. Then a soldier saying, "Hold, I see some," and the line died in a perfect, unnatural silence. No static, no fading, just absence. "It felt wrong," Caro whispered, "like something cut the world in half." Hennings asked if he had reported it. Caro laughed once. "Without humor, I tried. The moment I did, they told me I was fatigued, handed me a rest pass, and took the recording. That was 3 days ago. Haven't seen it since." He leaned closer. "Whatever's happening out there, someone doesn't want it in the system." After Caro left, Hennings sat alone with the weight of the files pressing against him. He felt trapped between two realities, the one on paper and the one being erased from it. His breaking point came with the file of Sergeant Lionel Briggs, the man who vanished after reporting strange figures on the ridge. The official report labeled him missing during night patrol, but the witness statements describing silent silhouettes had been removed entirely. Hennings searched for the original notes. They were gone. The next morning, he confronted his captain again, holding the Briggs file. This time, he didn't ask for explanations. "Sir, why are these specific details being removed?" The captain didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the office flap, shutting out the noise of the camp. "Hennings," he said quietly, "there are disappearances that can be verified, others that can be explained, and then there are cases that fall into neither category, cases that invite speculation that helps no one." He paused, measuring his next words. "The men are tired. The front is unstable. Command cannot afford rumors that damage morale or complicate strategy." Hennings felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "So we hide it. We contain it," the captain corrected. "There's a difference." "But sir," Hennings pressed, "what if these redactions are hiding something we need to understand?" The captain looked at him with an expression that seemed almost regretful. "Some things are not meant to be understood. Not during the war. Perhaps not ever." With that, he dismissed him. In the following weeks, Hennings noticed a new pattern. Certain files vanished from storage. Others appeared with new signatures, stamped by officers he had never seen. A few were marked classified, unauthorized access prohibited. These were placed in a locked chest guarded by military police, and always, at the heart of each restricted file, was the same persistent shape, soldiers disappearing without a trace, and reports shaped to erase anything unusual. But one document escaped the cleanup. It was a handwritten field note from a medic who examined the recovered body of the soldier found weeks after his disappearance. The note read, "Body intact, no trauma. Time of death inconsistent with weather conditions." Then a last line, shaky but clear, "Dog tags placed deliberately. Someone wanted us to find him." That note was never meant to survive. It had been misplaced between supply requisitions, hidden by accident. Hennings stared at it, pulse racing. Someone wanted one of the Vanish returned. Not all, just one. And that raised a question more unsettling than any empty footprint trail on a snowy ridge. Why return a single soldier? And why choose him? Before Hennings could follow the thread further, an officer arrived with new orders. He was being reassigned, effective immediately. No explanation given. His replacement didn't ask questions. His files were packed, sealed, and transported, but one box remained behind on a shelf, overlooked in the rush, a box containing reports with partial redactions, inconsistencies, and unfiled witness notes. A box no one noticed until the day a different set of eyes found it. The eyes of someone who knew those missing men personally and was willing to break rules to uncover the truth. Families, rumors, and the things no one could prevent. The box that everyone overlooked sat beneath a rusted lantern, gathering dust between stacks of supply manifests. It was small, nearly invisible in the clutter, yet heavy enough to rattle when lifted. Sergeant Daniel Keats found it by accident while searching for blankets for a frostbitten private. The metal corner caught on his sleeve, and when he pulled back, the box slid forward. Keats almost pushed it away until he saw a name scrawled on one of the folders inside. Rourke. Corporal James Rourke, his closest friend since basic training. For a moment, Keats forgot the cold, forgot the blistering wind slipping under the tent walls. He pulled out the folder and held it like something alive. Rourke's disappearance had carved a quiet hollow through him, a wound he carried behind a calm exterior. He had been told there was no evidence, no clarity, no final moment. Yet here, tucked inside a misplaced box, was something the Army had not shown the families, something the officers never mentioned. He opened the file slowly. The first page was clean and official. Standard language, standard loss. But beneath it, in sharp contrast, were the original no-straw handwriting, smudged by snow. The ink shaky from the cold. Tracks leading upward. Tracks ending abruptly. Not a single sign of engagement. Keats flipped to the next page. A witness had written, "Snow undisturbed beyond final footprints." Another, "No sound before silence." At the bottom, one more line, faded but readable. Not normal enemy action. The words vibrated through him. He kept reading, flipping deeper into the folder until something slipped out, a tiny photograph of Rourke, taken to nights before he disappeared. The edges were bent from being carried in a pocket. Rourke was smiling, wind pushing his hair sideways, snow collecting on his shoulders. Keats stared at his friend's face, a feeling rising from the pit of his chest: anger, grief, and something else. A sense that he had been lied to. He didn't return the folder to the box. Over the next week, word began to spread quietly, moving through the camp in whispers too soft for command to hear. A box of real reports. A box showing what had been hidden. No one admitted to sharing the rumor, yet somehow everyone knew about it. Men who had lost friends approached Keats subtly, asking if their patrols were inside. Some asked directly. Others hovered nearby, afraid of the answer. One night, a shy private approached with trembling hands. He asked if Keats could check for his brother. Unlike most, he didn't bring anger or suspicion, only a desperate hope that anything, even something terrible, might give him certainty. The file was there, but certainty wasn't. The report claimed the brother had fallen during an ambush, but the unedited account, buried 10 pages deep, described no shell casings, no blood, no battlefield remains, just a set of footprints leading to the mouth of a narrow pass, and then nothing. Keats didn't know what was worse, the truth, or the shape of the truth that wasn't there. The private read the note 3 times, lips pressed together. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, thanked Keats, and disappeared into the frozen night. Keats didn't see him again for days. Rumors multiplied. Soldiers began sharing stories they had never dared speak aloud. One man recalled seeing a figure standing alone on a ridge at dusk, still as ice, long after their patrol had abandoned that position. Another swore he heard his missing friend calling out during a retreat, same voice, same accent, but when he ran toward the sound, there was nothing but wind. None of it made sense. Yet none of it felt like lies. Our families back home, meanwhile, were fighting their own battles. Letters arrived weeks late, or not at all. Casualty notifications came phrased with an almost mechanical precision. Missing in action, fate undetermined, recovery unlikely due to conditions. Mothers and fathers read those lines until the ink felt etched into their memory. Some received contradictory information. One family in Ohio got a letter saying their son was missing. Another letter came days later describing a burial that had never happened. A month afterward, they received a third letter correcting both earlier messages. This wasn't confusion. It was something else. A widow from Alabama, kept every letter she ever received from the Army. One of them mentioned ongoing investigations. Another insisted there was no further information. Both arrived in envelopes with the same date stamp. She visited Washington more than once, hoping for clarity. Instead, she found polished desks, polite smiles, and voices trained to offer empathy without detail. "You've been given all available information," they told her. Years later, she swore the officer avoided her eyes when he said it. Veterans returning home carried their own different storied stories they shared in hushed reunions or dim bars far from anyone who might take notes. Some claimed men had been taken north unexpectedly. Others claimed small groups had been cut off and captured, but never officially acknowledged. Others described stranger things, seeing lights on ridges with no source, hearing radios crackle with voices speaking their names in distorted tones. One veteran, long retired, spoke about a night when a column moved through a valley where echoes behaved unnaturally, bouncing back at angles that made no sense. He believed one of the missing men had yelled for help because he recognized the fear in the voice. But when he turned, the man beside him had vanished instead. What frightened him wasn't the disappearance. It was that the voice calling for help had sounded like it came from the ground beneath him. None of these accounts matched each other, yet all of them suggested the official story wasn't complete. Through all this, Keats continued to study the box, late nights by lantern light, reading page after page until his eyes blurred. He kept seeing patterns, recurring phrases, rewritten explanations, and always the same pressure: erase uncertainty, contain fear, simplify the narrative. One detail began to haunt him. In nearly every disappearance case, there was a line he hadn't noticed before. Search terminated after recommendation by higher command. Recommendation. Not order, not necessity, recommendation. Someone far above the front lines kept urging these searches to end early. Why time, resources, or something more careful, more deliberate? Keats tried asking an intelligence officer he vaguely trusted, but the officer stiffened the moment the question left his lips. "I'm not discussing that," he said, "and neither should you." That night, Keats slept lightly, waking often at the slightest noise. He wasn't afraid of punishment. He was afraid of walking into the dark and realizing no one would search for him either. A few days later, the box disappeared. Not stolen, not misplaced. Removed, cleanly, quietly. When Keats asked around, no one knew who ordered it, or even who entered the tent to take it. But the absence left behind was unmistakable. He felt it the way a man feels a tooth suddenly missing from his mouth. Then, just before sunset one evening, a runner arrived at camp carrying a single envelope addressed to Keats. No return stamp, no name. Inside was one page, a photocopy of a report he had seen in the box. The report of Sergeant Briggs. But someone had written a line at the bottom, a line that wasn't in the original file. "They knew we were missing before we disappeared." Keats read it again and again. Those words changed everything. Because if the Army had known something was about to happen, then whatever took the soldiers wasn't random. And the person who wrote that line, they were still out there. Watching, waiting, or trying to be heard before they vanished too. The missing, the possible, and the silence. The envelope sat in Keats' hands long after the sun dropped behind the mountains. Cold winds slipped through the seams of the tent, making the thin paper tremble. He stared again at the sentence scrawled at the bottom of the copied report, the ink slightly smeared as though written in haste. "They knew we were missing before we disappeared." The words felt impossible, yet they carried the weight of someone who believed they were running out of time. Someone who understood something Keats didn't. Someone close enough to the truth to be afraid of it. He folded the page carefully, slid it into his breast pocket, and stepped outside. The night air hit like a blade. The camp was quieter than usual. Men huddled near heaters, others writing letters by lantern glow. A few standing guard with eyes fixed on the horizon. Everyone moved as though the cold were the only threat, but Keats felt a different chill. He walked slowly toward the ridge overlooking camp. Snow crunched under his boots. Breath rose from his mouth in small clouds. Behind him, the camp lights flickered like dying stars. Ahead, the landscape stretched into darkness, uneven, hostile, and full of secrets buried beneath ice and silence. He thought about Rourke, about Briggs, about the engineers who left their tools neatly lined up, about the glove frozen to the metal stake, about the lights described in reports that no longer existed. Why return one dead soldier and erase the rest? Why offer a single clue only to bury the rest under redactions and orders to clean the language? Keats closed his eyes. Someone wasn't just covering gaps. Someone was shaping the story. He returned to camp and sought out the only person he believed might still speak honestly. Sergeant Caro, the communications technician who had described the unnatural radio silence. Caro was sitting alone on a crate beside a smoldering barrel, warming his hands. His eyes flicked up when Keats approached. "You heard something," Keats said quietly. Caro's jaw tightened. "Plenty." "No," Keats said. "Something you didn't put in your report." Caro looked around the camp cautiously, then motioned for Keats to sit. His voice was low, barely audible above the wind. "Tonight's before the engineers vanished. I picked up a short-wave signal. Not enemy, not friendly. Something in between." Keats frowned. "In between?" Caro nodded. "Rhythmic, like breathing. Then it shifted like someone whispering through broken wires. I thought it was atmospheric distortion until it changed pitch, as if adjusting to us." "Adjusting?" Keats whispered. Caro nodded again, almost like it was learning how to sound human. The words punched a hole in the air between them. Keats tried to speak, but stopped, his throat dry. "Why didn't you mention it?" Caro gave a hollow laugh. "I tried. Command shut me down within an hour. Told me to focus on tangible signals. Then the recording disappeared, and they moved my bunk to the far edge of camp." Keats felt his pulse quicken. "You think they're listening?" Caro's eyes held a haunted certainty. "I don't think. I know." He paused, leaning forward. "And I think whatever's taking the men, it's not doing it randomly. It's selecting." Keats asked. Caro looked away, as if the darkness itself might be eavesdropping. "Certain patrol routes, certain positions, certain nights, always places where both sides avoid going." Keats felt something shift inside him like the slow, dreadful understanding of a map that had been upside down all along. "If command knows this is happening," Keats whispered, "why send men there?" Caro didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin and shaking, because admitting the truth is worse. Keats opened his mouth to ask what truth, but before he could, a sharp whistle tore through the camp. A runner sprinted toward them. Snow sprayed around his boots. His breath came in frantic bursts. "Sergeant Keats," he shouted. "You need to come, now." Keats stood so quickly the crate tipped over. He followed the runner across the icy ground, heart pounding. Men emerged from tents, startled, forming small clusters of confusion. The runner led him toward the western perimeter. That's where Keats saw it, a set of footprints, fresh, perfect, leading straight toward the ridge where no patrol had been for weeks. But the prints weren't from boots. They were bare feet, in the snow. Keats knelt beside them, jaw tightening. The prints were small, almost delicate. There was no blood, no sign of frostbite, just precise impressions marching forward. Caro arrived seconds later, breathless. "What in God's name?" One of the guards pointed toward the dark ridge. His voice cracked. "They go all the way up, and then stop." Keats felt the world tighten around him. He stood, fist clenched against the cold. "Who found these?" The guard swallowed hard. "No one. They were just here." Keats stared at the ridge, silent, unmoving, covered in pale snow that reflected the moon's bleak light. He felt the same suffocating tension that had haunted every disappearance file, the same sense of something unseen standing just beyond reach, behind him. Whispers swelled across the camp. Someone murmured a prayer. Someone else argued it was a trick of the light. But Keats knew better. These prints weren't random. Someone wanted them found. Someone was sending a message. He turned to Caro, whose face had gone almost ghostly. "Does command know?" Keats asked. Caro nodded stiffly. "They already sent someone to collect the prints." "Collect?" Keats repeated. Caro looked at him with a sorrowful certainty. "They're coming to erase everything." The word settled like frost. An officer appeared on the ridge above them, flanked by military police. His voice cut through the night. "All personnel return to quarters, immediately, no exceptions." Keats stared up at him, recognizing the tone, controlled, metallic, prepared. This wasn't a reaction. It was anticipation. Someone had been waiting for this. Caro leaned close, voice barely audible. "Whatever is happening, it's not just the disappearances. It's the reaction to them. They're afraid of what we'll see, or what we'll understand." Keats turned back toward the ridge, toward the prints that ended in nothing. Just like Rourke's, Briggs, and the countless others, for the first time, he felt the heavy truth settle over him. This wasn't just a cover dash up. It was containment. And whatever was being contained might not be staying hidden for much longer. Before he could breathe, a flare shot into the sky, bright red, hissing. Burning against the dark, Keats and Carol locked eyes, because red flares weren't used for warnings. They were used for emergencies already underway, and something had just breached the silence.